Ever feel like, your prayers are just kind of bouncing off the ceiling?
Like nobody's home upstairs.
Exactly. Well, today we're going to deep dive into a story about a woman named Hannah.
Ah,
Hannah's prayer was so powerful.
yeah.
It's still echoing, thousands of years later.
Really makes you think.
We've got this Sunday school lesson all about her, and I
Yeah.
gotta say, it's got me thinking, how can her story still speak to us today,
Well, what strikes me about Hannah's story is how it just grabs you.
Yeah.
It's about longing. It's about holding on to faith when things get rough.
Mm-hmm.
But it also gives us this fascinating look into ancient Israelite culture,
Oh, interesting.
especially the importance of childbirth back then and all the societal pressures.
Okay, so paint the picture for us.
Sure.
We're talking ancient Israel.
Right.
Having kids, especially sons.
Huge deal.
It was like winning the lottery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Continuing your family line,
Yeah.
fulfilling God's promises.
But Hannah, she's dealing with infertility.
In a culture where that's basically a big no-no.
Yeah, it's like a societal scarlet letter, right?
Exactly. And to make matters worse, she's in a polygamous marriage.
Oh, wow.
And her rival wife, Penina, she's got kids, and she is not shy about it.
Oh, that's gotta hurt.
Oh, you can just feel the sting of those taunts right there in the text.
Talk about pressure.
It's like a pressure cooker, right? Infertility, public humiliation.
And this constant reminder of what she's missing.
Yeah, it's tough.
Even her husband, Elkanah, the text says he loves her,
Yeah.
but he doesn't seem to get it,
He tries. He asks, am I not better to you than 10 sons?
Yeah.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg,
It's a surface level fix for a much deeper pain.
Exactly. Her struggle is so personal, so isolating.
And that pain drives her to prayer, right?
Yes, to the one place where she feels truly heard.
It says she travels with her family to Shiloh.
Shiloh, the religious center.
And there, at the tabernacle, she pours out her heart.
This isn't just a quiet little prayer.
Yeah.
She's weeping. Her soul is in agony, and only her lips are moving.
I can only imagine the desperation, the raw emotion.
It's so intense that Eli, the high priest,
It's Eli.
thinks she's drunk.
You're kidding. The high priest
The very person who should be attuned to spiritual matters.
completely misses the mark.
It makes you think, right? Even religious leaders can get it wrong,
Yeah, it's a good reminder to check our assumptions.
especially when someone's in pain, emotional or spiritual.
So Hannah, she sets him straight.
And then
She makes a vow.
a vow that tells us a lot about how seriously vows were taken back then.
What does she vow?
She promises God that if he gives her a son, she'll dedicate him to God's service for his whole life.
Wow, that's a big one.
A Nazarite vow, a serious commitment.
So is she bargaining with God?
Some scholars think so. If you give me this, I'll give you that.
But maybe it's more than that, right?
It could be ultimate surrender, acknowledging that any child is a gift from God.
And ultimately belongs to him anyway.
That's the question, isn't it? Bargain or faith or both.
It's fascinating.
Vows were huge in ancient Israel.
Especially Nazarite vow, a life set apart.
No cutting hair, no wine, complete dedication.
This isn't a casual promise.
Not at all. Think about the social implications for Samuel growing up in the tabernacle.
Surrounded by priests and rituals, a totally different life.
And remember, Eli's old, his sons, well,
They weren't exactly model citizens.
let's just say they weren't following in their father's footsteps.
So she's vowing to dedicate her son to a corrupt system.
It really highlights her faith, doesn't it?
She's not waiting for the perfect situation.
She trusts that God will protect her son, even in a flawed system.
It's like she's saying, okay, God, this is messy, but I trust you.
That's the core of it. Faith that doesn't depend on circumstances.
It's powerful, that kind of trust.
It's a lesson for us. We often wait for the perfect moment.
But Hannah shows us that sometimes God calls us to act, even when it's messy.
It's about trusting God can use our faith, even in tough times.
To do something good, something that changes things.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what are we doing today?
That might have a bigger impact than we realize.
That's worth thinking about.
But back to Hannah, she makes this vow. Eli blesses her.
And then,
The waiting game begins.
right, it's not instant gratification, is it?
No prayer request sent, answer received, notification.
There's waiting, uncertainty. Did God hear her? Will he answer?
That takes a different kind of faith.
Faith that can endure silence, hold on to hope, even when you can't see the answer.
And the waiting paid off, didn't it?
It did indeed. After all that time, all the wondering, Hannah gets her miracle.
A little baby boy.
She names him Samuel. God has heard.
It's like she's putting it right out there for everyone to see.
This child is proof.
God listens, even when it seems impossible.
And it connects to a bigger theme we see throughout the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
Women like Sarah and Rachel, they struggled with infertility too.
Right, right.
And then they become mothers to these key figures in God's plan.
It's like their struggles, their faith, they were part of something bigger.
Exactly. They paved the way.
Yeah.
But let's get back to Hannah.
She made a promise.
To dedicate Samuel to God's service.
And now she has to follow through.
Can you imagine the joy of motherhood, but also the letting go,
It couldn't have been easy.
especially with the state of things back then?
We were just talking about Eli's sons, the corruption.
To hand over your child, the answer to your prayers, into that environment.
It's a whole other level of trust.
It really makes you think about faith, about sacrifice.
Was she just blindly obeying? Or did she understand something deeper?
That God's plan, even when it seems messy, is ultimately for good.
That's a tough one. A lot of parents wrestle with that, even today.
How do we protect our kids and also believe God has a plan for them?
Even if it takes them into tough situations.
It's a balancing act. No easy answers.
But Hannah, she shows us what surrender looks like.
Trust in God, even when it doesn't make sense.
And look what happens. Samuel grows up to be a prophet, a judge.
A pivotal figure in Israel's history.
It's like her faith set off a chain reaction, something that changed everything.
It reminds me of that quote, what we do for ourselves dies with us, but what we do for others in the world, that remains.
It's like that, yeah.
Hannah's choice, her sacrifice, it had an impact far beyond her own life.
It's a spiritual butterfly effect, one small act of faith.
And we may never fully grasp the consequences.
But speaking of faith, let's go back to Hannah's song of praise.
Such a beautiful outpouring of gratitude and joy.
It tells us so much about her heart.
It's not just personal, it's theological. She talks about God's power.
His faithfulness, his justice.
She even foreshadows themes that we see later in Mary's Magnificat.
Hold on, for those of us who aren't theologians, what's the Magnificat?
Sure, it's Mary's song of praise when she learns she'll give birth to Jesus.
Oh.
It celebrates God's power to turn things upside down, to lift up the humble.
And Hannah's song is similar.
You see these amazing parallels. God's intervention, his faithfulness.
Let's heart for the underdog.
Exactly. So Hannah's story isn't just about one woman and her prayer.
It's part of a bigger story, God's plan of redemption.
And it makes you think maybe our own struggles, our prayers.
They're connected to something much bigger than we realize.
Like we're all part of this grand tapestry.
Our individual threads, even the messy ones, woven together by God.
And speaking of messy, let's not forget Eli's sons.
Their corruption, their abuse of power.
It could make you despair. Question God's goodness.
Like, really, God, this is the leadership in your holy tabernacle.
But Hannah's faith doesn't waver.
She doesn't let human flaws shake her trust in God.
She focuses on God's faithfulness, his ability to work through anyone.
Even imperfect people, in challenging situations.
It's a reminder we're not called to serve in perfect environments.
Sometimes our faith is tested not by persecution, but by everyday compromises.
The moral gray areas, the hypocrisy we might see in our own religious circles.
That's where Hannah's story really hits home.
It's not about finding the perfect church, the flawless pastor.
It's about trusting God in the midst of human brokenness.
Like she's saying, I see the mess, but I'm not giving up on you. A powerful lesson in perseverance, holding on to hope when things fall apart.
And don't forget, Hannah's persistent prayer.
She didn't just say a quick prayer and move on.
She wrestled with God, poured out her heart.
She refused to let go of her faith.
It makes you think about how we pray. Do we have that kind of intensity?
Have a refusal to give up, even when we don't see an answer right away.
Or are we more like, hey, God, fix this problem, thanks, bye.
It's easy to fall into that trap, isn't it?
But Hannah shows us that prayer is about more than a wish list.
It's about a relationship with God, seeking his guidance.
Aligning our hearts with his will.
And sometimes the answer comes through a change within us.
A deeper faith, a willingness to surrender to a plan bigger than our own. Yeah, it's about trusting the process even when we don't see the results right away.
Trusting God's timing. And speaking of that, think about Hannah taking Samuel to the tabernacle.
Years of longing, then the joy of having him, and now she has to let go.
It's like this precious gift she prayed for so hard.
And she's giving it away. Talk about a test of faith.
What must have been going through her mind as she left him there?
In that, let's be honest, not so great environment.
Did she doubt? Did she ever second guess herself?
We don't know for sure, but it's something to think about.
It's a question parents still ask today.
How much do we let go? How much do we protect?
When do we trust our gut? And when do we trust that God knows better?
Hannah, she chose to surrender, to trust God's plan.
even when it didn't make sense.
And look at the impact. Samuel became a prophet, a judge.
He shaped the future of Israel.
Her act of faith, it had these huge ripple effects throughout history.
It reminds me of that saying, what we do for ourselves dies with us, but what we do for others in the world, that lives on.
It's like she set something amazing in motion.
And it makes you wonder, what choices are we making today?
That might have consequences we can't even imagine.
Speaking of choices, remember the cultural context of Hannah's vow.
Vows were serious business back then, especially for women.
And a woman's vow needed her husband's okay.
I wonder what that conversation was like between Hannah and Elkanah.
About dedicating Samuel.
Must have been intense.
The joy, the weight of the promise, the uncertainty.
And sending their son into that mess with Eli's sons.
But they honored their vow. They trusted God.
Even when it seemed crazy.
It shows us that faith sometimes means leaving our comfort zones.
Embracing the unknown, believing God can work through anything.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Hannah's story, what stands out to you?
You know, for me, it's that reminder that even when things feel hopeless,
There's always hope.
Hannah's story, it teaches us about the power of prayer.
The importance of letting go of our own desires and trusting God.
And that even our small choices can make a difference.
It makes you think, what are we holding on to too tightly?
Where do we need to let go and trust God's timing?
What sacrifices are we being asked to make?
Because even small acts of faith can have a big impact.
These are big questions, questions that can help us understand what it really means to live a life of faith.
A life of surrender, obedience, and a willingness to step into the unknown.
That's the beauty of Hannah's story. It's not just ancient history.
It's a message that still speaks to us today.
Even when things are tough, even when our prayers seem to go unanswered,
God is still working, weaving this incredible tapestry.
more intricate and beautiful than we can imagine,
And maybe, like Hannah, we'll find that when we surrender.
when we let go and trust God's plan.
That's when we find the greatest blessing of all.
So next time you're struggling with a prayer that feels stuck,
Remember Hannah? Her persistence, her surrender, and how God honored her faith.
remember, the God who heard her prayer is still listening.
He's still working, still weaving together this story of redemption and hope.
Even in our messy, imperfect world,